The order came just before dawn, carried on a voice that was flat, devoid of emotion, and seemed to blend with the chill of the morning air. Remove your clothes. The women froze. The damp chill of the North African desert clung to their skin, a constant reminder of the weeks of dust and defeat. Somewhere in the distance, a jeep backfired, a sound sharp and sudden that made some flinch. But on this line, 200 captured German nurses, secretaries, and auxiliaries from Rommel's Africa Corps stood in stunned silence. They had heard whispers, grim tales of what awaited female prisoners in Allied hands. Now, it felt like their turn had come. One young woman, a radio operator named Alara, whispered, "So this is how it ends." The guards didn't respond, their faces shadowed and unreadable in the pre-dawn gloom. Boots shifted on the dusty ground. A jackal howled far off, the metallic tang of fear mixed with the desert's dry scent. Most of the women had endured days of forced march, their uniforms stained with grime and exhaustion. When the order came, it wasn't a shout, but a calm, almost rehearsed announcement. That made it worse. In that oppressive stillness, a second voice broke through, this one distinctly American, young but firm. "You will be inspected for vermin and infection. Standard medical procedure. No harm will come to you." But the words, though meant to reassure, felt out of place, an explanation of mercy in a moment that offered none. Impossible. The women hesitated. The guards waited, their rifles held loosely but ready. Sweat trickled down spines, dust clung to their bare legs. No one moved. Then, a former nurse named Annalise, known for her quiet strength, stepped forward. Her hands trembled slightly as she began to unbutton her tunic. The others followed, shame burning through their fear. Behind them, Allied medics, mostly American, began unfolding clean white sheets. Not ropes, not restraints, but towels. The shock hit harder than any bullet. An American officer, a young lieutenant with tired eyes, turned his face away as he handed Annalise a towel. She had expected revulsion or cruelty, but saw something akin to embarrassment. That flicker of human decency cracked something inside her, a tiny fissure in the wall of fear and indoctrination. This wasn't how enemies behaved. As they dried off, she noticed the guards keeping their distance, heads bowed slightly as if acknowledging, not dominating, their vulnerability. The air felt different now, not safe, but strange, too civilized for war. When the inspection ended, no one spoke. The women stood in stunned silence, still clutching their towels, unsure whether to thank their captors or brace for what came next. But before they could decide, another voice called out, "Proceed to medical tents for further checks. We will ensure all necessary care." The women entered a canvas tent that smelled of antiseptic and damp canvas. Lanterns flickered against the khaki walls, providing the first real shelter from the desert sun since their capture. Annalise clutched her towel tighter, her heartbeat a frantic drum against her ribs. She expected more humiliation, perhaps interrogation or photographs. Instead, a man in a crisp American medical uniform stepped forward, clipboard in hand, his eyes tired but steady. "Name," he asked softly. No bark, no sneer, just procedure.
Behind him, two nurses in white coats laid out sterilized instruments, gauze, and soap. The women exchanged confused glances. One whispered, "They're actually treating us." The officer, Captain Davies, didn't look directly at their faces as he worked, meticulously noting bruises, checking for fever, and applying ointment to open wounds. When he reached Annalise, her hands were trembling uncontrollably. "You're safe here," he murmured, though he knew the words would mean little in a war zone. Outside, the distant rumble of trucks and the chatter of the camp bled through the tent flaps. The war still raged beyond this small, strange island of mercy. But inside, something fragile was forming. A truce that no general had ordered. Annalise couldn't stop watching him. Not because he was kind, but because he seemed burdened by that kindness, as if decency itself was a dangerous liability. She noticed how he turned his head away each time a woman reached for a clean uniform. No smirks, no lingering eyes, just discomfort, the kind that comes from empathy. Later, the women were led to wash basins with hot water and actual soap. Their reflections in the skill basins made them flinch. Filthy, gaunt, unrecognizable, but alive. And no one shouted at them. No one struck them. They treat us like humans? Annalise whispered to the woman beside her. We were told they'd leave us to rot. The nurse didn't reply. She just nodded slowly, her eyes filling with something that wasn't quite tears. Perhaps confusion, perhaps a profound disorientation. By the time the inspection ended, the women were quiet. Wrapped in clean, freshly issued uniforms, the guards carried their old, soiled uniforms away to be burned. Outside, the setting sun threw long shadows over the tents. For the first time, Annalise realized these men didn't hate them in the way she had been taught to hate. They pitied them, she would soon learn.
Wake up, line up, eat, wash. But nothing felt real. The barbed wire glinted in the morning sun. Guards patrolled with rifles, but some smiled. Annalise couldn't understand this world where captives handed cigarettes to prisoners. It went against everything she'd been taught about honor, enemy, and shame. Near the fence, an American corporal flicked a lighter open and gestured toward the group. Smoke, he offered, in slow, broken German. A few women turned away, suspicious, but one reached out a trembling hand. When the first puff hit her lungs, she coughed, then laughed. A dry, stunned sound that spread through the group like static. Within minutes, the fence line looked like a small cafe after a battle. Prisoners sat cross-legged, sharing cigarettes, whispering. It wasn't comfort, it was confusion. Their training had painted the Allies as monsters, yet here was a man who apologized when he accidentally brushed a prisoner's arm. Annalise noted the detail like a scientist cataloging an impossible specimen. Behind her, the American sergeant, the same one from the inspection, watched silently. He kept the routine strict, meals on time, roll calls precise, medical checks regular, yet beneath the discipline, there was an undercurrent of respect. They treat us like soldiers, one woman muttered, half in disbelief. Another corrected her. No, like humans. That evening, Annalise was summoned to assist in the infirmary. She had once been a nurse in the Wehrmacht, and her skills were needed. Inside, she saw boxes stamped Medical Corps, U.S. Army, filled with clean bandages, morphine, quinine. She'd never seen such abundance. German hospitals had been running on scraps by the war's final year. She couldn't help whispering, they had too much of everything. Industrial victory was visible in every gauze roll and tin cup. When the shift ended, the same American corporal from the fence handed her a cigarette. She hesitated. Why? She asked. He exhaled smoke and grinned. Because you look like you need one, Fraulein. That night, Annalise couldn't sleep. She wrote something on a scrap of ration paper. Just one line, folded carefully into her tunic pocket. The enemy is not what we were told. But by morning, that note would disappear, taken during inspection and never seen again. The guards had searched the barracks at dawn, routine, efficient, emotionless. Every scrap of paper was confiscated, every folded corner flattened by foreign hands. When the inspection ended, Annalise's tunic felt lighter, as if a piece of her had been taken with it. Around her, murmurs spread. Letters, drawings, even pressed flowers, all gone. That afternoon, an American corporal read the camp bulletin aloud. No personal correspondence permitted until review by command. The announcement echoed through the yard, translated in fragments by a German interpreter. Some women lowered their heads, others stared blankly at the ground.
They weren't angry, just hollow. For them, words were the only escape. Annalise couldn't let it end there. That night, under the dim lantern light, she began writing again, this time on the back of a medical label. To whoever finds this, I was taught that surrender erased honor, but here I see men who show more honor than those who taught me. Her hand trembled, but the words felt alive. By the end of the week, dozens of such letters circulated secretly among the POWs. They weren't messages home, they were quiet confessions. Some apologizing to the dead, others describing small mercies. Historians later found that over 170 POW letters like these were archived, censored, or destroyed in Allied custody. Most were never read by their intended recipients. One evening, as Annalise folded her letter, a familiar voice interrupted. The American Sergeant Miller stood in the doorway. He didn't raise his rifle. He simply said, "You shouldn't risk this." His tone wasn't threatening. It was weary, almost protective. She met his eyes and asked softly, "Why do you care?" He didn't answer, just took the paper, hesitated, and slipped it into his pocket.
Annalise never saw her letter again, but weeks later, she noticed the sergeant carried something folded inside his chest pocket, always pressed against his heart. She never asked if it was hers. She didn't need to. That letter, sealed in silence, would soon decide both their fates, though neither could imagine how. Sergeant Miller sat on the edge of his bunk, the camp muffled in post-curfew silence. Outside, the jungle hummed with crickets and distant truck engines, but his focus was on a folded piece of paper resting in his palm, the letter. Her handwriting was neat, deliberate, shaped by discipline. He had confiscated dozens before, all destroyed per protocol, but this one he'd kept. He told himself it was for documentation. He knew that was a lie. He unfolded it again. The ink had bled slightly from sweat and humidity, but the words remained clear. They treat us with respect we do not deserve. Perhaps that is their strength. Miller read it twice, 3 times. He'd seen his share of prisoners, some violent, some broken, but never anyone who mirrored his own doubts back at him. Every guard had a coping rule: don't think too much. But after months on duty, the walls between duty and empathy were wearing thin. Commanders didn't warn you about that. They taught you how to keep order, not how to stay human. The next morning, during roll call, Miller caught Annalise's eye for a moment longer than he should have. She bowed slightly, a gesture of quiet understanding, not defiance. That single moment would have gone unnoticed if another soldier hadn't been watching. By midday, rumors crawled through the barracks. The Yank's gone soft, he's protecting one of them. It wasn't true, but truth mattered less than perception in war. That night, Lieutenant Harris summoned him. "Keep your distance, Miller," the officer warned. "We're not here to make friends." Miller nodded, jaw tight. "Yes, sir." But his mind replayed the words from her letter again and again. Allied records from 1945 show nearly 1 in 12 guards reported psychological strain from prolonged POW contact. The military called it sentimental fatigue. Miller called it conscience. He returned to his post, the folded letter still in his pocket. The barbed wire gleamed in moonlight. Annalise stood near the fence, silent. Their eyes met briefly. 2 prisoners of circumstance, divided by rules neither believed in anymore. Behind them, whispers grew. The camp was changing. Kindness had become suspect. The very humanity that had once shocked the prisoners was now turning against the men who showed it, and before long, the whispers would become orders. By the end of that week, the camp felt colder, though the North African heat hadn't changed. Soldiers spoke less, smoked more. The easy banter that once drifted between guards was replaced by murmurs. "You hear about Miller?" Someone whispered in the mess hall. "Reads their letters, talks to them like people." A few laughed, others didn't. In war, mercy was dangerous. It blurred the line that made killing possible. Rumors spread fast in isolation. The cooks claimed Miller gave extra bread to a North German nurse. The quartermasters swore he saw him pass something folded through the fence. None of it could be proven, but in the machinery of military gossip, proof wasn't needed.
By the third retelling, Miller wasn't just a lenient guard, he was a sympathizer. The irony wasn't lost on him. The very decency they were ordered to show, the Geneva rules, the medical inspections, the humane rations, was now being twisted into suspicion. One corporal muttered, "You treat them soft, they'll stab you in the back." Another replied, "She looks harmless till the knife's in your ribs." It didn't matter that there hadn't been a single escape attempt. Fear was oxygen in the barracks. Annalise noticed the change too. The cigarettes stopped, the smiles vanished. The guards looked through the prisoners, not at them. The small world of civility they'd built was cracking. One afternoon during laundry duty, Annalise overheard two American privates arguing outside the supply shed. One said, "You really think those women are just nurses? Spies more like. They know codes, radio ops, but half of them were trained." The other shrugged. "Maybe, but they're beaten now. Leave it." That night, Miller found a note on his cot. It wasn't signed.
Just 3 words scrawled in pencil: watch your back. Reports from 1945 confirm that over 300 suspected espionage cases surfaced across Allied North African commands. Most proved false, but paranoia never needed evidence. By morning, new orders were posted on the bulletin board. Certain detainees to be relocated, immediate transfer at dawn. A list followed. Annalise's name was on it. When Miller saw it, his throat went dry. He understood transfers happened all the time, but this one, it felt like erasure. As the trucks lined up under the floodlights, he knew he'd have to decide whether to obey his orders or defy them. The trucks were already idling when dawn cracked open the desert sky. Headlights cut through mist and dust, throwing long white beams across the yard. Prisoners stood in rows, silent, expressionless, clutching their few possessions in burlap sacks. The sound of engines drowned out the birds. Annalise was in the second row. Her name had been called 30 minutes earlier, her numbers stenciled onto a clipboard she wasn't allowed to see. Miller scanned the manifest again. 50. One prisoner scheduled for transfer to the British sector. Routine relocation, the lieutenant had said, but Miller knew the pattern. The troublemakers, the outspoken, the ones who'd drawn too much attention, and Annalise was on it. She caught his gaze once as the guards began to count heads. No words, just that same quiet recognition that had formed between them weeks ago. He wanted to say something, but speech felt dangerous now. The convoy commander barked, "Move!" Boots crunched on gravel, chains rattled softly, not restraints, but the sound of metal tailgates slamming shut. Each truck took on its load of prisoners, engines revving in rhythm. Miller walked alongside, clipboard pressed to his chest. When Annalise climbed aboard, she turned, hesitated, then did something that froze him completely. She saluted. Not a gesture of mockery or surrender, but respect, a soldier's acknowledgement of another. The nearby guards didn't notice. Miller stiffened instinctively, returned the salute with the smallest nod he dared risk. Annalise's last glimpse of him was through the slots of the truck's wooden side panels. Dust rose behind the convoy as it began to roll forward, sunlight bouncing off the barbed wire one last time. Reports show that nearly half of all POW transfers during the North African campaigns took place before sunrise, minimizing risk of sabotage or escape. To the prisoners, it only magnified the sense of vanishing into the dark. As the vehicles rumbled out of the American compound, Miller stood by the gate, helmet under his arm. The convoy faded into the haze, swallowed by the road leading toward the British camp near Tripoli. He didn't move for a long time, but his thoughts followed the trucks. He had her letter, her handwriting, her story folded in his pocket, and a growing suspicion that this transfer was no ordinary relocation. Because the British ran their camps differently, colder, cleaner, and far less forgiving. The British camp didn't smell like war. It smelled like canvas and stale tea. When the convoy rolled through the gates, Annalise's first impression was the rigid order. No shouting, no chaos, just military precision. Whitewashed barracks in perfect rows, flags snapping in the desert wind, guards in pressed uniforms who barely glanced at the prisoners. Everything was efficient, sterile, and impersonal. A sergeant with a clipboard called out names in quick, flat English. Each woman stepped forward, was assigned a number, then guided to a designated bunk. It felt less like captivity and more like processing,
like being turned into data. The Americans treated them like people. The British treated them like paperwork. Annalise tried to understand the new rhythm. Meals were exact: 7 o'clock, midday, 8 o'clock. Hygiene inspections daily. Medical checks weekly. Even their movements between barracks were timed. The food wasn't bad: canned beans, hardtack, weak coffee, but it tasted of metal and control. The British spoke less, smiled less. Their kindness was procedural, not emotional.
The Red Cross emblem hung on every building, but no one looked up when the prisoners passed. Compassion here had been industrialized. At night, Annalise lay awake, staring at the corrugated roof, glinting in the moonlight. The desert wind howled faintly in the distance, a reminder of freedom just beyond the wire. She missed the American sergeant's quiet nods, the small gestures that had felt human. Here, the guards didn't look away when the women undressed for inspection. They didn't look at all. Reports show that after 1945, British POW facilities processed more than 10,000 Axis captives per week across the European theater. Efficiency meant survival, but also distance. Annalise learned the new rules quickly: obey, stay invisible, forget softness. Yet part of her couldn't forget the towel handed to her in Manila, the cigarette shared through a fence. Humanity, once tasted, couldn't be untasted. One afternoon, a notice appeared on the barracks door, typed in block letters: mandatory showers, all detainees, hygiene inspection. The words sent a ripple of dread through the room. The women froze, their minds flashing back to the first command at the port: undress. No one spoke. The past was looping back, and they didn't yet know if mercy had an expiration date. The order was posted at dawn: all detainees to report to the hygiene station, no exceptions. Annalise stood in line again, the sun just beginning to climb, baking the corrugated roofs in gold. The déjà vu was suffocating. The same posture, the same words: undress. Only this time, the guard's tone was clipped, administrative, like reading from a manual. Inside the concrete shower block, the air stung of disinfectant and wet lime. Pipes ran across the ceiling, valves hissing softly. British medics moved briskly, rubber gloves snapping as they gestured the prisoners forward. No malice, no hesitation, just the hum of machinery and orders obeyed. Annalise's stomach nodded. The memory of that first moment in Manila, the towel, the terror, rushed back. She whispered to the woman beside her, "Do you think it's the same?" The woman didn't answer. Steam hissed, echoing like distant shellfire. Then a spray of fine mist filled the room. The women flinched, shielding your faces. But it wasn't gas. It was disinfectant. Cold, sharp. The smell of Dettol mixed with soap and metal, flooding every sense. One of the nurses in white coats shouted over the noise, "Keep your eyes closed." 2 minutes. The British had reduced hygiene to science. Every motion timed, every droplet measured. The result? Fewer outbreaks, fewer deaths. Reports noted a 90% reduction in disease in camps that used dignity protocols. To the medics, it was victory through sanitation. To the prisoners, it was confusion through kindness. As Annalise scrubbed herself with the coarse soap, something inside her shifted. This wasn't humiliation anymore. It was decontamination. They weren't cleansing her as an enemy, but as a human organism. She caught a glimpse of her reflection in a puddle at her feet. Hair matted, skin raw, but alive. When the valves shut off, silence fell except for the dripping water. The guards handed out towels, faces blank, detached. Annalise wrapped herself, trembling. For a fleeting second, she realized the fear had evaporated, not because she trusted them, but because this ritual wasn't about power. It was about procedure. As the lion moved toward the exit, the mirror above the basin caught her reflection again. For the first time, she saw no prisoner, no enemy, just a survivor. But that reflection would haunt her, because soon she'd have to face what survival really meant. When the steam cleared,
The mirrors told stories no one wanted to face. The room was silent except for the slow drip of water onto concrete. Annalise stood before a fogged mirror, her towel clutched around her shoulders, watching her own eyes emerge through the haze. They looked older, hollow, searching, almost unrecognizable. For months, she'd imagined her captors as devils. Now, staring at her own reflection, she wasn't sure who the devil had been. She reached out and wiped the glass. The motion revealed the thin scar running across her collarbone, a wound from a shell fragment during the retreat from Tunis. She remembered her commander telling her, "Pain proves loyalty." But here, pain had no purpose.
It wasn't demanded. It wasn't rewarded. It just existed. Behind her, a medic handed out clean underclothes, plain and white. The women took them silently, moving with mechanical precision. Their uniforms, the symbols of their empire, were gone, burned the night before. All that remained was the human form beneath. The transformation was quiet, but profound. Later, health reports would record measurable changes, body weight increasing by 40% in 6 months, disease nearly eliminated. Yet, no statistic could capture what was happening inside these women's minds. The enemy's mercy was dismantling their faith in everything they'd been taught. Annalise found herself helping the weakest among them, holding hands, sharing rations, whispering comfort. Empathy, once seen as weakness, now felt like rebellion. "They clean our bodies," she murmured one night, "and somehow they clean our hatred too." The camp routines became her new clock: morning roll call, meals, hygiene checks. The guards remained distant but predictable, and predictability was a strange kind of safety. For the first time, sleep came without nightmares. One evening, as the sun bled across the desert horizon, she stood near the wire fence and caught sight of an Allied truck arriving with newspapers. The war, it seemed, was moving somewhere she couldn't see. Whispers spread among the prisoners. Berlin bombed, the Führer silent, strange new weapons mentioned in coded tones. That night, Annalise returned to the mirror. The same face stared back, but this time there was no fear, no disbelief, just waiting. She didn't know it yet, but the next sound she'd hear would not be gunfire. It would be surrender. The announcement came not with gunfire or trumpets, but through a crackling loudspeaker mounted on a jeep. Midday, May 8th, 1945. The British camp stood still under the burning desert sun as a sergeant adjusted the dial, his voice barely louder than the static. Germany has accepted the terms of unconditional surrender. For a moment, no one moved. The words hung in the humid air like smoke after a blast. The German women froze in place, hands still mid-task, laundry buckets half-dipped, spoons paused over tin plates. No cheering, no collapse, just silence so complete that even the wind seemed to stop. Annalise's breath caught. She'd imagined this day 1,000 ways: fire, vengeance, collapse. But this, a single voice declaring the end of everything she'd believed in, it felt unreal. Around her, the women stared at one another as if waiting for someone to interpret the meaning. The British guards didn't celebrate either. They simply removed their helmets and stood in stillness. Even they seemed to sense that this wasn't victory, it was a eulogy. The world they'd fought to destroy had surrendered, and yet no one looked triumphant. Annalise sank to her knees, not from grief, but from confusion. If surrender wasn't shame, what was it? She remembered the mirror, the towel, the cigarette, the small mercies that had redefined her idea of enemy and honor. Maybe this moment wasn't defeat, but release. Nearby, a British officer lowered the camp flag to half-mast, a gesture that made the women whisper, respect for them, for the dead, for everyone who hadn't survived long enough to hear the radio crackle. The loudspeaker played faint music next to a static-filled broadcast of Admiral Donitz's voice, formal and restrained. Words most of them couldn't hear clearly, but knew by tone. It wasn't surrender as humiliation, it was surrender as survival. One woman began to cry softly, almost politely. Another followed, but Annalise stayed still, her face dry, her heart strangely calm. For the first time she thought, we are all just human. The guards began to walk the perimeter again, but slower now, as if unsure what came next. The war had ended, but the camp gates didn't open, because peace, she realized, doesn't arrive with a key. It arrives with waiting. The Mediterranean was glass when the repatriation ship left Tripoli Bay. Rows of German women stood along the railing, their khaki-issued coats fluttering in the warm wind, watching the city shrink into haze. The war was over, but the air still carried its taste: salt, dust, and memory.